This disaster didn't just happen. It wasn't a random act of fate or a bolt from the blue. It was predicted. It was documented, studied, and modeled by experts who spent their careers trying to sound the alarm. They warned America for years, laying out the exact chain of events that would lead to catastrophe. And when it finally happened, the damage wasn't just physical. It was psychological. It was a wound of regret, a painful lesson in what happens when we refuse to listen. The story of this disaster is the story of a failure of imagination, a failure of courage, and a failure that was, in the end, completely and utterly avoidable. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a choice made over and over again by people who should have known better until the day the warnings ran out and the consequences arrived right on schedule. Years before the collapse, long before the headlines and the national mourning, specialists started noticing troubling patterns. They were subtle at first, buried deep in datasets and technical reports. These weren't dramatic, Hollywood-style predictions. They were quiet, academic observations. The reports mentioned a deadly cocktail of risks. First, there was the aging infrastructure. Concrete, steel, and systems built for a different era were being pushed far beyond their intended lifespan, slowly degrading under the quiet pressure of time. Then, there was the increasing environmental stress. Shifting conditions were putting new, unforeseen pressures on these old structures, pressures they were never designed to handle. And finally, the most dangerous factor of all, human overconfidence. A belief that because nothing had gone wrong yet, nothing ever would. The warnings were technical, they were dry, filled with jargon and charts. And that's precisely what made them so easy to ignore. They didn't scream danger, they whispered it. And in a world filled with noise, the whispers were lost. These early signs were like a doctor telling a patient about slightly elevated cholesterol, a problem for another day, easily dismissed until the day it's a heart attack. As the years went by, the whispers grew a little louder. Studies were commissioned, sometimes by government agencies, sometimes by private firms. Risk assessments were written, peer-reviewed, and published in journals that few outside a specific field would ever read. These documents were shockingly prescient. Some included detailed timelines, mapping out how a cascade of small failures could lead to a single, catastrophic event. Others painted a vivid picture of the worst-case scenarios, not for shock value, but as a necessary part of responsible planning. They even offered clear, actionable recommendations. Fortify this section. Upgrade this system. Change this procedure. The solutions were on the table, but they all came with a price tag. Implementing these safeguards cost money, political capital, and public attention. And disasters that haven't happened yet rarely feel urgent. It's a fundamental flaw in human psychology. We are wired to react to immediate threats, not abstract future ones. So the reports were filed away. The recommendations were deemed under consideration, and the clock kept ticking. In boardrooms and government offices, the cost of prevention was weighed against the probability of disaster. And time and again, the decision was to roll the dice. Then came the near misses. In the lead-up to the main event, the system started to show cracks in more obvious ways. Minor incidents began to pop up, things that would later be seen as glaring red flags. A small component fails, but is quickly patched up. A sensor gives a strange reading, but is dismissed as a glitch. A routine inspection notes an anomaly, but classifies it as low priority. These were the close calls, the moments when disaster almost struck, but was averted by sheer luck or a last-minute intervention. Each one was treated as an isolated event. It was written off in a report, labeled unlikely to recur, or a rare statistical outlier, or a manageable operational issue. No one was connecting the dots. They saw a series of individual random problems. They failed to see the pattern. It was like a string of small tremors before a massive earthquake. Individually, each one was unsettling but manageable. But together, they were the unmistakable sign that the ground beneath their feet was about to give way. The system was screaming for help, but everyone was only listening to one scream at a time. In the final years, the tone of the warnings changed. The academic detachment fell away, replaced by a growing sense of urgency, even desperation. The language became sharper, more direct. Words like could and might were replaced with will and when. The predictions narrowed. Experts were no longer talking about a general risk. They were pointing to specific vulnerabilities, specific timelines. Their confidence in their models grew with each new piece of data that confirmed their fears. They weren't asking asterisk if asterisk anymore. They were asking asterisk when asterisk. They tried to get their message out, speaking at conferences, briefing officials, and trying to get the attention of the press. But they were fighting against a powerful inertia. The narrative of safety and stability was too comforting to abandon. To the public and to many in power, these experts started to sound like fanatics, like doomsayers crying wolf. Their increasingly frantic warnings were dismissed as alarmism. It was the final tragic phase of denial. The evidence was overwhelming, the forecast was clear, but the will to act simply wasn't there. They were standing on the beach, pointing at the receding water, and telling everyone a tsunami was coming, but no one wanted to leave the sunshine. And then it happened. When the disaster finally struck, it was almost poetic in its predictability. It unfolded not as a chaotic, random event, but as a grim, step-by-step execution of the scenarios laid out in those ignored reports. The points of failure were the exact ones that had been highlighted years before. The cascade of events followed the same logical progression the models had predicted. The locations that suffered the most were the ones identified as being at the highest risk. The scope of the damage, the fallout, the consequences, it all matched the worst-case scenarios that had been dismissed as overly dramatic. In the aftermath, as investigators sifted through the wreckage, their reports used a chillingly consistent vocabulary. They described the disaster as foreseeable. They concluded it was preventable. One senior investigator famously called it a long-anticipated failure. There was no surprise among those who had been paying attention, only a profound sense of sadness and frustration. The script had been written years in advance, and on that fateful day, reality simply performed it, line by line. In the weeks and months that followed, the search for answers began. Inquiries were launched, committees were formed, and a wave of national soul-searching washed over the country. And as they dug, the documents began to resurface. Dusty reports were pulled from filing cabinets. Old emails were retrieved from forgotten servers. The warnings, once ignored, were now front-page news. Suddenly, the experts who had been dismissed as alarmists were being called to testify as prophets. The public was shown the charts, the timelines, the rejected recommendations. The story became clear. This was not a mystery. It was a case of willful blindness. And as the truth emerged, a single agonizing question echoed through the halls of power, in newsrooms and in living rooms across America. Why? Why didn't we listen? Why didn't we act sooner? The cost of prevention, once seen as too high, now seemed laughably small compared to the astronomical cost of the recovery. The realization dawned that this wasn't just a failure of concrete and steel. It was a human failure, a collective failure, born from apathy, bureaucracy, and a deadly lack of foresight. This story isn't really about one specific disaster. It's a parable that applies to so many situations. It's about how we, as a society, process warnings. It's about our relationship with uncomfortable truths. We love to believe in stories of sudden, unpredictable catastrophes because they absolve us of responsibility. But the reality is, the most dangerous disasters are rarely a surprise. They build over time, they announce their arrival, and they give us countless opportunities to get out of the way. The real lesson here is that the greatest threats we face aren't the ones we do and see coming. They are the ones we see clearly but choose to ignore. They are the problems we defer, the warnings we dismiss, and the difficult choices we avoid. Because a problem ignored is not a problem solved. It's a crisis in waiting. The next major disaster probably won't be a secret. Its warnings are likely being published in a report right now, being discussed in a conference room, or being sent in an email that someone will decide not to act on. The real question is, next time, will we listen? If this story shocked you, wait until you hear about the U.S. government project that was shut down by politicians, just months before it could have prevented a major national disaster. Subscribe to Civic Mind Facts for the true American stories they definitely don't teach you in school. Thanks for watching.